The food service industry is incredibly old. For example, we have evidence going back at least 3,500 years that food vendors operated on the streets of ancient Greece, selling people food. Or if we want to talk about something closer to what we think of restaurants today, we can go all the way back to the 12th century in China, where establishments popped up for travelers to enter, sit down, and be served food. We can also talk about things like a restaurant, Sobrino de Bolton, which operates out of Madrid. It's been continuously operating since 1725 in the exact same location. And this lets you think about all sorts of interesting things, like the fact that Mozart and Clint Eastwood have both dined in the exact same dining room. And I bring this up because the food service industry has been around for so long that they've had to learn a lot of things. They've had to learn how to be reliable, because an unreliable restaurant is one that people aren't going to visit, and it's not going to be one that is going to prosper. We can learn lessons. Reliability is not just about computer services. It really impacts everything. And so this talk wants to explore a little bit about what it's like to think about reliability from a different standpoint. Hi, my name is Alex Hidalgo, and I'm the Director of Site Reliability Engineering at Noble 9. But for this talk, it's probably more useful to mention that I am also a former server, bartender, line cook, busser, runner, and restaurant manager. At some point, I've probably worked just about every single position in the food service industry. So let's talk about what it's like to go out to a restaurant. And if we have to imagine we're in the before times or the after times, let's just try to imagine going out to a restaurant with our friends for celebrating a birthday or something similar. And while we're hoping to have a good time, of course, things can go wrong. Nothing's ever perfect. Failures happen. Well, what kind of things go wrong at restaurants? Let's just discuss a few. Little things like you could get the wrong order. This could be everything from literally being brought the wrong dish. Perhaps it was intended for someone else at your table, or perhaps it was intended for an entirely separate table entirely. Or it could be the case that the server misunderstood you and actually placed the wrong order. Your food could also be cooked badly. Perhaps it's burnt to an absolute crisp. Or this could also be something like you order a steak and you want it to be medium rare, but it showed up well done. That's still a failure. Or you could receive an incorrect bill. Perhaps the bill has items on it that you didn't order, or the opposite. It's still a failure if the bill isn't charging you everything that you should. Or it could be an incorrect bill in the sense it was intended for a different table, but was dropped off with you instead. The point is just that there's a bunch of different failure modes that can happen at restaurants, yet most of us continue to dine out. And that's because good restaurants are reliable. Good restaurants have learned how to deal with these kind of failures. And while acknowledging that, of course, they're always going to happen, nothing is perfect, they figure out ways to ensure that they don't happen too often. So let's talk about a simplified version of a restaurant as a system. You have three primary components in most restaurants. You have the floor, and this is where servers operate. This is where you sit down at a table and you're presented with a menu. And you have the bar, which is normally operated by a subsection of the restaurant, generally has different employees. And it's also a little different from the floor because generally speaking, you don't need someone to seat you there. You can often just walk up and grab your own seat. And then you have the kitchen, the place where the food's made, the real heart of the restaurant. But really, it's kind of inconsistent, and it's not precise to talk about these as just three individual components, because each of these components is very complex as well. On the floor, of course, you don't just have one server, you have many, and they all interact in different ways. And same with the bar. If it's a busy bar, you may have more than one bartender, and you may also have a bar back who isn't there to serve drinks, but just there to make sure that drinks are being cleaned up and glasses are being cleaned. And of course, the kitchen is very complex, and we'll get into that much more later. But it's even inconsistent to really think of a restaurant as only these three components. That might be an easy way for us to have a hypothetical discussion, but there's so much more at play, of course. At like a nice restaurant, you'll have a host, perhaps a maitre d' if it's extra fancy, and these are the people responsible for ensuring that reservations are being honored and that people are being seated at the right tables. And in between the servers and the cooks, you often may also have runners and bussers. A runner's job is just to bring dishes from the kitchen to the table. They don't take orders or anything like that, but they're just there to help expedite things. You may also have bussers, which are people who are responsible just for cleaning the tables or perhaps refilling your water and then resetting the tables for the next customers after you leave. And in the kitchen, we can go much further. We could have a whole talk about kitchen dynamics. And of course, you don't just have the cooks, you also have the dishwashers and people doing prep for you. At fancier restaurants, you may have your own butcher. And that actually brings us to a really interesting point, because ask anyone who's ever worked at a restaurant. The single most important person in the entire building is almost certainly the dishwasher. Because if they're not doing their job and they're not being reliable, no one else can do theirs. And this is just an example of how complex systems are everywhere. We often use this term in the tech industry to talk about our computer services, and it's certainly appropriate to do so. But sometimes that leaves us a little short-sighted in terms of where else complex systems exist. And almost everything is a complex system. Biological organisms are, our political systems, the cars like that we drive, the buildings that we live in. And it's important to note this, I think, because this means that keeping our own complex systems, our own computer complex systems running and reliable, chances are we can learn lessons from elsewhere. And it's important to note that restaurants aren't just a complex system in and of themselves. They're made up of many component complex systems. Just like how a restaurant is a complex system, so is the floor as one component of that, or the bar as one component of that, or the kitchen as one component of that. But for now, let's just stick with these three kind of categories because it'll be a little easier to talk about. And let's just define them a little bit more. So the floor, as we talked about before, this is the primary interaction for most customers. This is where you go, you get seated, you're given a menu, you're able to order your dishes, you brought your dishes, etc. And from the restaurant perspective, what the floor is doing is it takes requests and it then fulfills them, kind of like an API might. And because of this, the floor has dependencies on both the bar and the kitchen. The floor does not actually produce much itself in most restaurants. Chances are it needs the bar to make drinks for the customers, and it may need the kitchen to prepare the food for the customers. And that's where the bar differs a little bit, because it may seem very similar, but it's the primary interaction for some customers, people who are only going in to sit at the bar and just have a drink, but it's a secondary interaction for others. If you are sitting on the floor, you are still relying on the bar to make your drink for you. So this often means that the floor requires them to operate, unless you're just drinking water or a soda, perhaps. And the bar also has a soft dependency on the kitchen because some people may be ordering food, but the majority of the bar probably aren't. And then finally, we have the kitchen. I think one of the interesting points here is that there's no direct customer impact. There's no direct customer interaction. It's the most important service at a restaurant. You can't really operate if you don't have a kitchen. It's always required for the restaurant to do what it's supposed to be doing, but you never actually interact with it in most cases as a customer. So we have the floor, the bar, and the kitchen. What are some ways that these may fail? And how have restaurants adopted ways to ensure that they can remain as reliable as possible? Because as soon as you insert customers, things can get a little more hectic. So let's first focus on the floor, and let's talk about some ways that things may go wrong there. We'll categorize these as service problems, and some of this may end up sounding familiar to you. We could go on and come up with many more examples than that, but let's talk about these four to start off with. Some potential failures are your food's delivered late, your food is cooked badly, the wrong food is brought out, or instructions are just simply not followed. So for food that's delivered late, the problem is really just that the food took longer than the customer requirements. Some dishes are quick and some are slow, and that's actually fine as long as the customer knows that and is okay with that. At many restaurants, you may see a whole roast chicken on the menu, and they may have a little note saying, this dish takes 30 minutes. And so while that may be longer than most customers want to wait, if they're ordering that dish, they're probably okay with it. The point is not every dish has to come out at the same cadence. Not every dish has to be ready in 5 or 10 minutes, as long as it comes out in a reasonable amount of time. as long as it meets the customer requirements. And the equivalence here is just latency. Just like with someone ordering a certain dish, not every API and not every call has to successfully respond within the same amount of time, as long as it's responding in the amount of time required by the users of that service. And so from a restaurant point of view, how are some ways that you may be able to address issues where you are delivering your food too late too often? You may just hire more kitchen staff. It could be that you're simply not able to produce food at the rate that you need to. Or you could hire runners if you don't have any. As we discussed, runners are employees whose job is primarily just to bring food from the kitchen to the floor. Sometimes it could be that you have enough kitchen staff producing the food and you have enough servers working with the customers, but there's still a hiccup in getting it from the kitchen out to the floor. Or maybe you need to seat a better number of customers per section. If a single server is too overloaded, they may not be able to get everything done in time. And these have direct correlations to what we think of in terms of keeping computer services reliable. Hiring more kitchen staff is the equivalent of adding more resources, scaling vertically or horizontally. Sometimes you just need more human power to get stuff done, just like sometimes you need more compute power to get things done. Hiring runners is like introducing some kind of routing service, something that makes sure that the packets get from point A to point B in a more reasonable manner. Or talking about seating a better number of customers and ensuring that the rotation there is correct, that's simply just load balancing. A good host looks at the different sections that servers have been assigned to and ensures that they're cycling through those at a reasonable cadence. They want to make sure that no single server is getting completely overwhelmed. And this doesn't just mean round robin, because if you seat a two-seater at one server section and then a party of 10 in another server section, it doesn't make sense to immediately go back and seat another group in that server section. They may need some time to catch up first. In terms of your food being cooked badly, the problem is just the food itself is not acceptable. The equivalent we can draw here is these are errors. These are responses from the API coming back that are just incorrect. They're not what was being asked for. And restaurants know how to deal with this. So they have a few different options here. They could hire more staff, similar to our first discussion. Maybe you just need more people, you need more resources, or maybe you need to simplify the recipes. If the food or the responses are wrong too often, maybe it's because the calculations needed, the recipes needed, are just too difficult to follow in any kind of consistent basis. Or instead of simplifying recipes, maybe you just remove the difficult recipes entirely. Maybe you simplify the whole menu by removing the things that are messed up most often. And so again, we have some pretty direct parallels to things we talk about a lot in tech. Right? Hiring more staff, once again, that's the equivalent of adding more resources. Simplifying your recipes may be an example of refactoring your architecture or your code base. And removing difficult dishes could be something like deprecating potentially problematic parts of your service. And if your food has been brought out wrong, this is just an example of data correctness problems. And the solution here might be to hire an expediter. An expediter is someone who stands on the line and their only job is to ensure that the cooks are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And they often examine every single dish before it's handed to a runner or a server for it to go out. By having someone dedicated to performing this verification, restaurants can make sure that the wrong food is not brought out too often. Or we can talk about instructions not being followed. And the equivalence here, we could draw a million different parallels, but let's just say that this is the equivalent of having a bug in your code. And the solution here is just fix the dish ASAP. You need to get it right and you need to get it out. And this is just the equivalent of having quick feedback loops and a strong release process. Now let's talk about the bar a little bit, because while it seems very similar to the floor in the sense that customers order things and then things are provided for that customer, there are some interesting differences. And the bar, you really run into complexity a lot more. So the biggest differences between the bar and the floor is that requests are ad hoc. You may have a menu of drinks that are special to your restaurant or developed by your bartenders, but you also have to be ready for just about any request possible. The floor has a menu, and sure, sometimes people ask for modifications, and occasionally they may even ask for something that isn't on the menu entirely. But those are rare. Those are outliers. The bars to deal with this constantly. People expect to be able to walk in and order whatever their favorite drink is, almost no matter what it is. The bar also has more ambiguous load requirements. While sure, a restaurant may get busier on the service side of things than anticipated, and sometimes someone calls out and therefore you don't have enough servers to cover everything, it's still a little bit more defined. Servers generally show up for the day. They know they have their 6-table section, and they can kind of anticipate how busy they're going to be depending on the day of the week. The bar, this is a lot more complicated because, first off, generally speaking, people at a bar don't just sit at the bar stools. You may have 12 bar stools at your bar, but 30 or 40 people drinking, because it's not uncommon for people to stand up and even pack the bar 2, 3, 4 rows deep. And the latency requirements are much stricter at the bar. If someone orders a beer directly from the bartender, they generally expect that to be delivered to them within 30 seconds or a minute. But if you are ordering a beer to go along with your meal on the floor, you understand it may take 4 or 5 minutes for that to show up, because you understand the server has to go to the bartender and ensure the bartender knows that they need to get that beer and deliver the beer to the server, et cetera, et cetera. So you just have a different kind of concept of what customer expectations are when they order something. And the other interesting thing to point out, I think, is that the bar is its primary data source, while the floor and the servers, they rely on either the bar or the kitchen to produce the products that they ultimately deliver to the customers. The bar is producing the products that it gives to its customers directly. So what are some failures that can happen at the bar? Well, drinks can be made late, right? You order a drink and it's still not made 4 minutes later, 5 minutes later, like that might upset you. The wrong drink is mixed. This could be anything from, being handed the entirely incorrect drink to perhaps you ordered a, whiskey Coke with some Irish whiskey in it, a Jameson, but really you're delivered something with a bourbon in it, like Jack Daniels. People may not even notice that as often, but that's still a failure. Customers could also just be greeted or served late. The interesting thing here to know is that the floor often has a dedicated host, someone whose entire job it is to greet customers and interact with them. At the bar, the people making the drinks and dealing with everything are also often the people who need to greet customers. So here you have another layer of complexity, because there's just one more task that a bartender is responsible for. But additionally, there's also the fact that customers may not be consulted correctly, because bartenders are generally assumed to be able to recommend things. And while a server may be asked things like, what's your favorite dish, or is the special good, that's a different kind of consultation than what wine will go well with this meal. Of course, it's worth noting, nicer restaurants have people dedicated to that, sommeliers for wines, like all that kind of stuff. But like at a standard restaurant, that's often left up to the bartender. What's also interesting to point out is that the bar has multiple user classes. One user of the bar is the servers, the people taking the orders from people on the floor, bringing it to the bar, and then returning it. But they also deal with direct customers. And these direct customers, we can split up into even more classes. You may have your beer wine drinker. This can sometimes require a consultation, but very often someone just says, hey, I want a Stella. So the bartender goes and pours a Stella or opens a Stella, depending on if it's draft or not, and and delivers that. And then someone may just ask for, I want a Chardonnay. So the bartender goes and gets the Chardonnay and pours it into a glass, and delivers it. But then slightly more complicated, you may have simple mixed drinks. Let's think back to the whiskey Coke we just talked about. It's something fairly simple. It only has a few ingredients. You put ice in, you add the whiskey, you fill it up with Coke. You often put a garnish. Generally, a lime goes with a whiskey Coke. And it's not too much more complicated, but it does involve a few more steps. So this can take you more time. And within the simple drinks list, I would even include things like, let's say, a tequila sunrise. You need to know how to make one of those, even if you only serve one once a quarter. Of course, we also have advanced mixed drinks, mixologist stuff that requires muddling and various fruit components. And those can take even longer and can be very complicated. Sometimes it's difficult to remember what the recipes for those even are. And of course, you also have non-alcoholic drinks. And this is very important to note. The bar often does not only provide the alcoholic drinks, it's often the source of many of the non-alcoholic drinks as well. And so you can see just the bar deals with a different kind of complexity than the servers on the floor might. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a more difficult job. It really depends on the restaurant, of course, and what your patronage looks like, what your users, your customers look like. But being a bartender can get very complex very quickly. Because let's drill down even more into some of these multiple classes of direct customer. As we mentioned before, you may just have basic imbibers of beer and wine, people who just say, give me brand X or give me varietal Y. But you're also going to run into experts. You're going to run into people who know what they're talking about, or at least pretend to. So now you're going to have questions like, what kind of sours do you have? Do you have an IPA that you can recommend? What wine would you recommend to go with a fish special? And here, quality of service can be very important because the kind of people who are going to ask these kind of questions may very well know what they're doing, and they might be more upset than others if you don't get it right. Going back to mixed drinks, we kind of have the concept here that you need to have a knowledge of many drinks. You better not have to look up how to make a rum and Coke. So you should probably have that in your cache. That should be at the forefront of your mind. And again, if we talk about the aforementioned tequila sunrise, something you don't make very often, you at least need to be able to go look that up. That's why most bars have a little book of recipes. But on top of those standard drink recipes, you also often at nicer bars have a list of custom drinks. And you might be the bartender who actually came up with them. So maybe you know the recipes, but all the other bartenders, they need to know how to make them. And they've never ran into this drink before because it's entirely unique. And for this, you need specified recipes that are very available and accessible. And this is kind of like the equivalent of having a rum book. And now in terms of talking about non-alcoholic drinks, everything from a soda to a mocktail, which may itself be very complicated to create. The important thing to note here is that this is a great example of data correctness and data integrity because you cannot mess this up. If you serve someone the wrong dish, they can often turn it back around. If you give someone the wrong beer, they can often say, hey, I asked for beer A, you give me beer B, and it's not that big of a deal. But you absolutely cannot serve alcoholic drinks to someone who's asked for a non-alcoholic one. Finally, let's spend a few minutes talking about the kitchen. And I think an interesting perspective on the kitchen is that working in one is really like dealing with an incident every single night. Kitchens are chaotic, they are hectic, and you need to have a plan to ensure that you can deal with every service correctly. And like any good incident management, this really boils down to just a few different bullet points. One, you need to make sure that you're prepared. You need to make sure that you understand that an incident may happen or service is going to happen tonight, and you need to make sure that you've done everything you can to handle that. The next part that I often talk about in terms of incident management, you need some kind of established hierarchy. When things are chaotic and things are hectic, everyone needs to know who's in charge and everyone needs to know who is doing what. And finally, you should have some kind of formalized communications, because unless you're sure that you understand what everyone else is saying and what they're communicating to you, an incident can become a disaster in no time at all. So let's first talk about preparation and how the kitchen prepares. So there's this term mise en place, which is French for everything in its place. And the concept here is that in order to prepare for service, you need to make sure that you have everything available to you, that you need. Sometimes this might be something like just ensuring you have salt, pepper, and oil within arm's reach. And sometimes it means you actually have to prepare things. So you show up early for the shift because you need an hour to prepare all the different components of the dishes that you're going to be making later on that evening. And part of this is also communicating what you have to people. If someone else runs out of the, like the pre-seared, like pork chops, perhaps you need to be able to provide some for them. What's interesting about mise en place is that actually working in a kitchen, it really has three different meanings. It can be used as a noun. Is your mise ready? It can be used as a verb. Mise the mushrooms now. And it's also often thought of as a state of mind. I am in my place is another way of thinking about mise en place. I have prepared. I am ready. I know the reservations are about to start showing up. I know tonight is going to be hectic, but I've prepared myself. I'm ready for this. Another important part, and in fact, something that was almost invented by kitchens, is having a properly established hierarchy. So here you see a version of the brigade system, which was invented by Escoffier centuries ago, and it's still in use at most Western restaurants today. You have an executive chef, who's in charge of everything. You have a sous chef who's often responsible for delegating tasks to others. And then you have very specialized chefs. You have a saucier, a poissonnier, and, these are very equivalent to how you properly manage incidents. You make sure that you have an operations lead for the databases and an operations lead for the front end. You make sure you have someone responsible for communications as a communications lead or a planning lead for a long running incident. There's too much to get into here to talk about it, but the fact is, well-operated restaurants have a very clearly established hierarchy and a very clearly established role-based system where everyone knows what everyone else is doing at any point in time. Otherwise, kitchens would never survive the incidents that is any night of service. And this is accomplished by knowing who's in charge, knowing who's doing what, and everyone knows what's expected of everyone else as well. And finally, let's spend a few minutes talking about formalized communications. A kitchen cannot possibly handle a very busy night unless everyone is speaking the same language. Now, kitchen slang is very in-depth, and we could probably spend several talks talking just about how that all works. It really is its own kind of language. It is worth also noting that it differs slightly from restaurant to restaurant. While many terms are pretty well established, across the industry, you're always going to find these little bits of lingo that have been picked up at just this one establishment or perhaps a series of establishments. But no matter what, it's always coherent to the people operating, like within that system. So a few examples, some of which you've probably heard of. The concept of yes, chef. This just means acknowledged. Just like how when you're dealing with an incident and the incident commander asks you to do something, you respond with acknowledge. You let them know, yes, I heard you. I'm going to go do that now. And that's exactly what yes, chef means. Get me things all day just means in total, I need this. And we'll talk about that a bit on the next slide because I think it's a little interesting. Fire thing means do this now. In a restaurant, of course, fire thing generally means prepare this dish. But it is the equivalent of an incident commander or some kind of lead during an incident telling someone else, do this thing. Terms like in the weeds have left the restaurant industry, and we're probably all familiar with it. It just means that you can't keep up. And this can be very important to communicate in a kitchen as well. If you working a certain position just can't keep up anymore, everyone else working in that kitchen has to understand that so they can plan their components of the dish correctly. And they also have things just like yelling behind, hot, sharp. These are single, very easy to understand and quick commands to basically telling someone else, don't move. That's what this really means, because you're saying, I'm about to pass behind you and I may be carrying something hot or something sharp. And all day is really an interesting one to me because it differentiates from working off of tickets. Generally speaking, the line is the various people making your food, like they're giving tickets, and these tickets correspond to individual tables. And the goal is to get everything done on that ticket, right? So a ticket just describes a concrete area of work that needs to be accomplished, which may sound familiar and is exactly where we got the term ticket in the computer industry. So a lot of this was just analogous. And a lot of this may not have absolutely blown your mind, but I think it's an important example of how we can look to other industries and other complex systems and learn lessons from them about how they stay reliable, because everyone's dealing with the same issues that we are. Ours may involve computers, and in restaurants, it may involve a lot more human interaction and ensuring dishes are correctly created, but they're both still just complex systems, and you both keep them reliable in very similar ways. So remember, it may seem simple to you when you walk into a restaurant and you interface with a single server, and that's the only person that you deal with. But really, anytime you're visiting a restaurant, you're dealing with a very complex system with many, many, many moving parts. So if there are a few lessons that I would like people to walk away from here, just that everyone needs reliability. Reliability is not just about computer services. That's how you and I may use that term a lot of the time, but everything needs to be reliable in order for it to succeed. You can look anywhere for help. Don't just look within our own industry, and definitely don't look within your own company, because we can all learn from each other. We can all help each other be better. Thanks.